Have you ever seen a debate so powerful it leaves a legend speechless? Today we take you inside The View, where Vice President JD Vance faced off against Whoopi Goldberg in a battle of words that no one saw coming. Sparks flew, tensions rose, and for the first time in years, Whoopi found herself at a loss. Was this the moment The View lost its grip on the narrative? Stay with us, because what happened next will leave you stunned. Hit like, subscribe, and let's dive in. The atmosphere inside The View's studio crackled with energy. On one side sat Whoopi Goldberg, a Hollywood legend and a dominant force on The View, her name synonymous with sharp comebacks, unfiltered opinions, and the ability to shut down dissenting voices with ease. For years she had dictated the tempo of the show, steering debates, dismissing conservative viewpoints, and winning over the crowd with her signature wit and authority. But today, the guest sitting across from her wasn't just another Republican politician walking into The View's lion's den. Today, she was up against Vice President JD Vance. JD Vance wasn't just any conservative. He was a man who had defied the odds. Born into poverty in the hills of Appalachia, raised by a struggling family, and yet, through sheer determination, had climbed his way to Yale Law School, built a successful career, and ultimately landed one of the most powerful positions in the country. He wasn't a polished Washington insider. He was a fighter, a voice for the working class, and someone who had spent his entire life proving people wrong. From the moment JD Vance took his seat, Whoopi's demeanor was unmistakable, calm, confident, and just a little amused. She had done this before. She had faced and dismantled countless conservative guests, and she saw no reason why today would be any different. The audience, too, seemed to settle in for what they assumed would be the usual spectacle. Whoopi delivering sharp takedowns, the panel nodding in agreement, and the conservative guests struggling to keep up. But today wasn't going to be like the others. As the first few questions rolled in, JD remained composed. His answers were clear, measured, confident. There was no hesitation, no nervous fumbling, no rush to defend himself. He wasn't here to play defense. He was here to challenge the very foundation of the narrative Whoopi had spent years reinforcing. And then it happened. Whoopi leaned forward, her voice laced with that signature mix of sarcasm and authority that had made her a legend in daytime television. The moment she had been waiting for, the moment the audience had been primed for, had finally arrived. "Mr. Vice President," she said, a smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. "Isn't it ironic that a guy like you, someone who benefited from progressive policies, is now sitting here criticizing them?" The audience chuckled, a few claps rippling through the studio. They could sense blood in the water. This was it. This was the moment JD would struggle, the moment Whoopi would seize control, the moment the segment would go viral with yet another clip of her shutting down a conservative opponent. But then, something happened that no one expected. JD Vance didn't flinch. He didn't stammer. He didn't shift in his seat. Instead, he smiled, because he knew exactly how he was going to respond. The moment Whoopi Goldberg leaned forward, the entire studio felt it. This wasn't just a question, it was an ambush, a calculated move designed to put Vice President JD Vance on the defensive. She had done this before, time and time again, effortlessly dismantling conservative guests who dared to step onto The View. "Mr. Vice President," Whoopi began, her smirk widening, "I just find it fascinating, no, ironic, that a guy like you, someone who grew up in poverty, who got a Yale education and climbed his way to power, is now sitting here criticizing the very progressive policies that made it possible for you." A wave of laughter rippled through the audience. The panelists nodded in approval. Whoopi leaned back, arms crossed, waiting for JD to fumble, to scramble for a defense, to give her the moment that would go viral. But JD didn't flinch. Instead, he let the room settle, the laughter fade. He sat there, calm, composed, in complete control of himself. And then, with a measured tone, he spoke. "You're right, Whoopi," he said, his voice firm but even. "I do recognize the irony. I recognize that my story, growing up poor, working my way through school, is exactly the kind of story that's often used to justify these policies. But let me ask you something. If these policies were so effective, why are so many kids from my background still stuck in the same cycle of poverty? Why are so many families still struggling despite decades of government intervention? The room went still. The smirk on Whoopi's face faltered, just for a second. JD pressed on. I'm not saying opportunity doesn't matter, but success should not be credited to a political movement. It should be credited to hard work, to resilience, to the values we teach our kids. And what I refuse to accept is the idea that without a certain ideology, people like me wouldn't have a future. The energy in the room shifted. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. Whoopi, however, wasn't done. She chuckled dryly. So what, JD? You're saying that all the policies we fought for, civil rights, affirmative action, social programs, they meant nothing? That they didn't help you? JD didn't blink. I'm saying they're not the reason I'm here, he replied. I'm here because my grandmother taught me about personal responsibility. Because I worked late nights to put myself through school. Because I believed in something bigger than government programs. And I refuse to accept the narrative that says people can't succeed unless the government holds their hand. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Whoopi noticed it. She shifted in her seat, shaking her head. You talk about personal responsibility, but let's be honest. You worked for an administration that rolled back policies meant to help struggling communities. You're standing here acting like government isn't necessary, but the administration you served in actively made life harder for millions of Americans. This time, a few audience members clapped. Whoopi's co-hosts leaned in, sensing a chance to reclaim control of the conversation. JD Vance smiled. With all due respect, Whoopi said, his voice unwavering, if those policies were working, why are we still having this conversation? Why do so many Americans feel left behind? Why are schools failing? Why are jobs disappearing? Maybe, just maybe, it's because we've spent too much time telling people that the system will take care of them, instead of empowering them to take care of themselves. Whoopi opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. She hesitated. The audience wasn't cheering like they usually did. Some were nodding along with JD's words, others simply sat in silence, processing. Whoopi exhaled sharply. She had been here before, debating conservatives, shutting them down with ease. But this felt different. JD Vance wasn't just surviving, he was flipping the script. She let out a small, forced laugh. Oh, so now you're saying we should just get rid of all social programs? Just let people figure it out on their own? JD leaned forward. I'm saying that real progress isn't about making people dependent on government. It's about making people independent. And right now we have a culture that tells people they're victims instead of telling them they're capable. Silence. The audience wasn't sure how to react. Even some of Whoopi's biggest supporters seemed unsure. She had to change tactics fast. Whoopi sat back, tapping her fingers against the table. You've got some well-rehearsed lines, Mr. Vice President, she said, shaking her head. But let's be real. Do you really think most Americans agree with you? JD didn't hesitate. I don't need to represent a majority or a minority, he said. I just need to represent the truth. And just like that, the energy in the room shifted again. For the first time in years, Whoopi Goldberg wasn't in control of the conversation. Whoopi Goldberg had played this game before. She knew the rules, and more importantly, she knew how to bend them to her will. For years, The View had been her domain, a place where she dictated the tempo, controlled the conversation, and ensured that any conservative guest left either frustrated, flustered, or defeated. But today, something was different. JD Vance wasn't flustered, he wasn't defensive, and worst of all, for Whoopi at least, he wasn't backing down. The vice president sat comfortably in his chair, exuding a quiet confidence that made Whoopi uneasy. She had just hit him with one of her signature attacks, accusing him of working for an administration that rolled back progress and hurt the very people he claimed to stand for. Normally, this would be the moment where a conservative guest would scramble, desperately trying to explain themselves while Whoopi and her co-hosts cut them off, laughing, dismissing, and moving on before they could regain their footing. But JD didn't take the bait. Instead, he leaned forward, his expression calm but razor-sharp. "With all due respect, Whoopi," he said, his voice steady, "what exactly do you mean by progress? Because as far as I can tell, the only thing that's progressed in America over the last few decades is division, debt, and a system that tells people they're victims instead of victors." The air in the studio shifted. The audience, normally quick to cheer for Whoopi, hesitated. Whoopi scoffed, shaking her head. "Oh, come on, JD. You're telling me that social programs, civil rights protections, economic reforms, none of that made a difference? You really think we'd be better off without them?" JD didn't blink. "I think we'd be better off if we stopped acting like the government is the solution to every problem," he said. "Because the truth is, Whoopi, no law, no policy, no program can replace personal responsibility, strong families, and a culture that rewards hard work instead of victimhood." A murmur rippled through the audience. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Whoopi shifted in her seat. She was losing control of the narrative, and she knew it. So she did what she had done countless times before. She went for the personal attack. "Oh, so now you're saying people who rely on government aid are lazy?" she shot back, her voice sharp, challenging him to walk into the trap. JD, however, had seen it coming from a mile away. "No, Whoopi," he said, shaking his head. "I'm saying that when the government tells people that they need it to survive, it's not lifting them up. It's holding them down. Look around. After decades of these so-called progressive policies, are families stronger? Are schools better? Are communities thriving? Or are we more divided than ever, with more people feeling hopeless, angry, and powerless?" The audience was dead silent now. JD's words hung in the air, undeniable. For the first time, Whoopi Goldberg, the powerhouse, the veteran, the woman who had dominated The View for years, didn't have a response. She opened her mouth, then shut it. For a brief second, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, and the cameras caught it. The panelists, sensing the shift, looked at one another, unsure how to steer the conversation back in Whoopi's favor. JD Vance had done the impossible. He had put Whoopi Goldberg on the defensive. Sensing the moment, he pressed on. "The problem isn't that we've had progress, Whoopi," he said, his voice measured but firm. "The problem is that we've replaced opportunity with entitlement. Instead of teaching people that they are capable, we've built a system that tells them they need a savior, whether it's the government, the media, or a political movement. But real change, real success, that comes from within." A slow, hesitant clap echoed from the back of the audience. Then another, and another, until suddenly pockets of applause spread throughout the room. Whoopi's expression hardened. This was not how things were supposed to go. The audience was supposed to cheer for her, to back her every word, to drown out the guest if necessary. But today they were listening. JD Vance leaned back in his chair, a small, knowing smile on his lips. He didn't need to say anything else. Whoopi Goldberg had just lost control of The View. Whoopi Goldberg was no stranger to debates. She had built her career on sharp wit, blunt takedowns, and an uncanny ability to steer conversations to her advantage. The View was her arena, her home turf, where she controlled the pace, the questions, and the energy in the room. But today, that control was slipping through her fingers. Vice President JD Vance had not only withstood her attacks, but he had also done something no one else had managed to do on The View. He had forced the audience to think. There were no automatic bursts of applause, no waves of laughter at his expense. Instead, there was silence. And Whoopi hated it. She leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingers against the table, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. She needed to regain control, fast. "Okay, JD," she said, her tone shifting, sharpening. "You're sitting here talking about opportunity, about personal responsibility, about how people don't need the government to succeed. But let me ask you this. What about the people who can't just work harder? What about the single mothers struggling to put food on the table? What about the kids born into poverty with no access to a decent education? Are you saying they should just pull themselves up by their bootstraps and hope for the best? A murmur of approval rippled through the audience. Whoopi's co-hosts straightened in their seats, sensing an opportunity to reclaim the narrative. JD Vance, however, didn't waver. He met her gaze, calm and unwavering. Then, in a voice steady as steel, he replied, "No, Whoopi. I'm saying they deserve better than a system that tells them they'll never make it without government intervention." The murmur died down. JD pressed on, his voice carrying through the silent studio. "I know what it's like to grow up in a struggling family. I know what it's like to wonder if you'll ever escape the circumstances you were born into. And I'll tell you what helped me. It wasn't a government check. It wasn't a program that kept me dependent. It was the people around me. It was teachers who pushed me to be better. It was a grandmother who refused to let me believe I was a victim. And it was a country that still believed in hard work, in perseverance, in the idea that where you start doesn't have to define where you finish." The tension in the room was thick. Whoopi scoffed, shaking her head. "Oh, come on. You think just telling people to work harder is going to fix everything? That's the problem with people like you. You talk about the American dream like it's still real, like we're still living in a country where everyone has the same shot at success. But wake up, JD. This isn't your grandmother's America anymore." JD leaned forward, his expression unreadable. Then he delivered the blow that no one saw coming. "You're right, Whoopi," he said. "It's not, and people like you are the reason why." Gasps rippled through the audience. The co-hosts shifted uncomfortably. Whoopi's lips parted slightly, as if she hadn't expected him to hit back so directly. JD didn't stop. "You and people like you have spent years telling Americans that they can't make it on their own, that they're helpless, that they need government handouts, ideological movements, and celebrities to fight their battles for them. And do you know what that's done? It's robbed them of hope. It's created generations of people who believe the system is rigged against them instead of believing in themselves." A hush fell over the studio. Whoopi sat frozen, her usual confidence wavering. JD leaned back in his chair, glancing at the audience. "I believe in the American dream because I lived it, and I refuse to let people like you tell the next generation that it's dead just because it doesn't fit your narrative." For the first time in years, Whoopi Goldberg had no comeback. The audience was silent, waiting, watching, but Whoopi said nothing. She glanced at her co-hosts, searching for an opening, a way to pivot, a way to take back control. But the truth was written all over her face. She knew she had lost. And JD Vance? He just smiled. The show ended, but the real battle had just begun. Within minutes, clips of the heated exchange between Vice President JD Vance and Whoopi Goldberg flooded social media. Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube exploded with reactions. Some hailed JD's performance as a defining moment in modern political discourse, proof that someone had finally stood up to The View's one-sided narrative. Others, longtime supporters of Whoopi, scrambled to defend her, claiming she had been unfairly ambushed on her own show. But the real shock wasn't just the debate itself. It was the reaction of the audience. For the first time in years, The View's normally unified front had been shaken. The people who were expected to cheer on Whoopi, to laugh at her jabs, to dismiss her opponent without a second thought, many of them didn't. Instead, they sat in silence, thinking, processing. At ABC headquarters, executives weren't celebrating, they were panicking. Reports flooded in that audience engagement was shifting. Sponsors were uneasy. Internal discussions began about whether The View needed to reassess its format to better reflect a wider range of perspectives. Meanwhile, JD Vance didn't waste time. He appeared on multiple platforms, reinforcing the ideas he had laid out on the show. He didn't just win a debate, he started a larger conversation, one that was long overdue. Because this was never just about JD Vance versus Whoopi Goldberg. It was about something much bigger. It was about the narratives we accept without question, about who controls the conversation in America, about whether mainstream media actually represents the voices of the people or just amplifies a select few. And that's where you come in. Did this moment make you think? Do you believe JD Vance exposed a bias in media, or do you side with Whoopi Goldberg? Do you think The View should bring on more diverse perspectives, or is it fine the way it is? Drop a comment below. Let's have a real conversation. And if you found this discussion eye-opening, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because real debates, real discussions should never be silenced.